I have carried this weight for 7 decades now, and my bones are finally failing under its mass. The Medicae servitors tell me I have perhaps 3 days remaining before my organs surrender to time's inexorable accounting. 3 days to confess what I witnessed in those final months before the galaxy burned. 3 days to speak of the Regent, of the sealed dispatches, of the visitor who should not have been on Terra, and of the moment I understood that everything we had built was already dying before the first shot was fired. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I was born in the administrative warrens beneath the Himalaysian plateau, the son of a census compiler and a nutrient paste quality assessor. Unremarkable origins for what became a remarkable posting. I rose through 17 tiers of imperial bureaucracy over 32 years, processing tithe assessments, cross-referencing population surveys, verifying compliance documentation for sectors I would never see. I was efficient, I was invisible, I was precisely the kind of man the Imperium manufactured by the billions, a human cogitator processing data, until death released me from service. Then, in my 49th year, I received the summons that would destroy everything I understood about the galaxy. The Regent required a new attendant. His previous aide had suffered what the official documentation termed catastrophic neural fatigue, though I later learned the man had simply walked into the void lock of an orbital transport and cycled the airlock without a suit. The position demanded someone with clearance to handle sensitive materials, someone without family connections that might compromise security, someone old enough to be beyond ambition but young enough to be useful. I met every criterion. I reported to the Sigillite's administrative annex on the morning of my 49th naming day, expecting to serve as one of dozens of functionaries managing the endless paperwork of galactic governance. I did not expect to be brought into the inner chambers. I did not expect to meet the Regent himself on my first day. The memory of that initial encounter remains crystalline even now, preserved by the sheer impossibility of what I witnessed. The Sigillite's personal study occupied a space that should not have existed within the palace's geometry, a room of angles that suggested depth without possessing it, of shadows that moved independent of light sources. He sat behind a desk carved from material I could not identify, a substance that seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it, and when he looked up at my entrance, I understood for the first time why some men are called more than human. He was old. That was my first impression. Old in a way that transcended mere years, old in the way mountains are old, or stars, or the fundamental forces that bind reality together. His face was a landscape of lines and hollows, skin stretched tight over a skull that seemed slightly wrong in its proportions, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds gathering over a dying world. He studied me for perhaps 30 seconds without speaking, and in that silence I felt the weight of evaluation, of being measured against criteria I could not comprehend. "You are adequate," he said finally. His voice carried harmonics that resonated in my chest cavity, frequencies that seemed to bypass my ears entirely. "You will serve." Those 4 words defined the next 18 months of my existence. I learned quickly that service to the Regent meant existing in a state of perpetual partial ignorance. He shared what he deemed necessary and nothing more, parceling out information like a miser distributing coins to beggars. I processed his correspondence, maintained his scheduling matrix, ensured his chambers were supplied with the various stimulants and medications he required to maintain consciousness through sessions that sometimes lasted for days without interruption. I saw documents that would have earned me summary execution if spoken of outside those walls. I heard conversations that reshaped my understanding of the Imperium's true nature. And through it all, I said nothing, asked nothing, maintained the perfect silence of a useful tool. It was the sound of footsteps that first alerted me that something had changed. The Regent's study existed within a web of corridors and antechambers, spaces designed to filter visitors through progressive layers of security and intimidation. I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of those spaces, the particular cadence of custodian boots on marble, the softer tread of administrative functionaries, the measured pace of the Sigillite himself. Each type of visitor announced themselves through their footfalls long before they reached my desk in the outer chamber. I could identify the arrival of military commanders, planetary governors, high-ranking adepts of various imperial organizations, all by the distinctive patterns of their approach. On the 217th day of my service, a dispatch courier arrived whose footsteps I did not recognize. This should not have been possible. I had catalogued every variety of visitor who possessed clearance to enter the Regent's domain. I knew the shuffle of aged diplomats, the confident stride of successful generals, the hurried patter of emergency messengers. But these footsteps belonged to no category I had established. They were too quiet for military personnel, too measured for bureaucrats, and they possessed a quality I can only describe as deliberate, as if each step was being consciously placed rather than simply taken. The courier entered my antechamber, and I understood immediately why I had not recognized the approach. He was not merely a courier. The uniform was correct, the credentials were impeccable, the documentation chain was flawless, but the man wearing these trappings was something else entirely. His face was forgettable in a way that suggested design rather than nature, features so precisely average that my eyes seemed to slide off them, refusing to form a coherent image. He handed me the dispatch case, received my authentication stamp, and departed without speaking a word. The case itself was sealed with marks I had never seen before, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. I logged its arrival according to protocol and carried it into the Regent's study, placing it on the corner of his desk designated for priority communications. The Sigillite opened the case while I stood waiting for dismissal. I watched his face as he read the contents, watched the subtle shift in his expression that most observers would have missed entirely. His eyes moved across the document once, twice, 3 times. Then he set the papers down and stared at the wall behind me for exactly 47 seconds. I counted. I had learned to count everything in his presence, to measure time in heartbeats and breaths, to anchor myself against the disorientation that came from proximity to his particular form of being. "Leave me," he said finally. I withdrew to my station, but I had seen something I was not meant to see. In that 47 seconds of silence, the Regent's hand had moved to touch a drawer in his desk, a drawer I had never seen him open, a drawer I had not known existed until that moment. He had not opened it, he had simply touched it, as if reassuring himself that its contents remained within reach. And the expression on his face during that touch was one I recognized from my years processing casualty reports and disaster assessments. It was the expression of a man confirming his worst expectations. I did not ask about the dispatch. Questions were not part of my function, but I began to observe more carefully after that day, cataloging details I had previously allowed to pass unexamined. The sealed dispatch had changed something fundamental in the Regent's demeanor. He worked longer hours, though I had not thought this possible. He received fewer visitors, declining meetings that previously would have been accepted without hesitation. And he began, for the first time in my service, to show signs of something I can only call grief. The footsteps of that unknown courier echoed in my memory. I heard them in my dreams, measured and deliberate, approaching a door that never opened. I began listening for their return, but the corridor outside my antechamber remained occupied only by familiar sounds, familiar patterns, familiar rhythms. Whatever message had arrived in that sealed case, no response seemed forthcoming. It was 3 weeks later when I noticed the first absence. I maintained the Regent's correspondence archive, a vast collection of documents stretching back decades, communications with every significant power within the Imperium. Part of my daily duties involved cross-referencing incoming messages against previous communications, ensuring continuity of dialogue, flagging inconsistencies for review. It was tedious work, the kind of task that rewards obsessive attention to detail, and I had developed systems for tracking the flow of information that would have impressed even the most dedicated administratum adept. One of the 18 legions had stopped sending reports. This should have been immediately apparent to any observer, but the Regent's filing systems were designed to obscure precisely this type of pattern. Documents were catalogued by subject matter, rather than origin, dispersed across hundreds of categories that prevented any single overview of communication frequency. I only noticed because I had begun, unconsciously, to track which sources appeared in my daily sorting. I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of Legion communications, the regular pulse of campaign updates and requisition requests and personnel assessments that formed the heartbeat of the Great Crusade's military apparatus. Now that heartbeat had developed an arrhythmia. I reviewed 3 months of records before I was certain. The reports had not merely decreased in frequency, they had stopped entirely, replaced by acknowledgement receipts that contained no substantive information, form responses that met the technical requirements of communication without actually communicating anything. And when I traced these empty responses back through the archive, I found that they had been accepted without comment, processed through the standard channels, filed away as if they contained the same operational detail as their predecessors. Someone was maintaining the appearance of normal communication while providing nothing of value. I documented my findings in a private notation, encrypted with personal ciphers I had developed during my decades of bureaucratic service. I did not report my observations to the Regent. This was not cowardice, though I will not pretend courage played any role in my decision. I simply did not understand what I was seeing. A single Legion's communication failure could indicate any number of mundane explanations: equipment malfunction, administrative oversight, even deliberate security measures for sensitive operations. I had no context for interpreting the pattern, no framework for understanding why this particular silence felt different from the routine gaps that appeared regularly in Imperial record-keeping. But I continued watching, and 2 weeks later I noticed a second absence, then a third. The silences spread like a disease through the Regent's communication networks. One by one, the great legions that formed the Imperium's military backbone went quiet, their detailed reports replaced by the same empty acknowledgements, the same hollow forms, the same careful maintenance of appearance without substance. I mapped the pattern on a private data slate, marking the dates when each voice fell silent, and what I saw terrified me more than any Xenos threat or warp horror I had encountered in decades of Imperial service. The absences were not random. They clustered around specific command structures, specific campaign zones, specific relationships within the military hierarchy. And they all traced back, through chains of association I could barely perceive, to the same point of origin: the War Master's command fleet. I knew better than to speak of what I suspected. The War Master was the Emperor's chosen champion, the greatest of the Emperor's sons, the supreme commander of all Imperial military forces. To suggest any connection between his authority and the spreading silence in Legion communications would be treason of the highest order. I would be executed before I could finish voicing the accusation, my family erased from all records, my existence scrubbed from Imperial history as thoroughly as if I had never been born. But I watched the Regent's face when he reviewed the empty reports. I saw the lack of surprise, the absence of investigation, the quiet acceptance of patterns that should have triggered immediate inquiry. And I understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones like winter cold, that he already knew what I was beginning to suspect. He had known since the sealed dispatch arrived. The sound of those unfamiliar footsteps haunted me through the following weeks. I heard them in the silence between heartbeats, in the gaps between words, in the spaces where truth should have been spoken and was not. I began to understand that I was witnessing the architecture of catastrophe, watching the foundations of everything I had served crack and shift while the surface remained apparently intact. The Imperium continued to function. The Great Crusade continued to advance. The endless machinery of galactic administration ground forward without pause or hesitation. But beneath that surface, something was dying. I might have continued in ignorance, might have convinced myself that my observations were paranoid fantasies, might have buried my suspicions beneath the comfortable weight of routine. Duty. I wanted to believe that I was wrong. I wanted to believe that the Regent's grief was for something else. Some personal loss I could not comprehend, some burden of leadership that had nothing to do with the patterns I was seeing in his communications. Then the visitor arrived who should not have been on Terra. I did not see them enter the palace. I did not see them approach through the corridors that led to the regent's domain. I simply looked up from my work one evening, in the hours when the palace's illumination dimmed to simulate nightfall, and found a figure standing in my antechamber who had not been there a moment before. They wore robes that seemed to drink light, fabric so dark it created the impression of a humanoid void standing in the center of the room. A hood concealed their features, but what I glimpsed beneath that concealment was not a face I recognized. It was not, I realized with a shock that stopped my heart for 3 full beats, a face that belonged to any human I had ever encountered. The proportions were wrong, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but definitively wrong. The skull beneath the hood was too large, the spacing of the features too perfect in its symmetry, and the eyes that regarded me from within that darkness were not the eyes of a mortal being. "I will see the regent," the figure said. The voice was soft, cultured, carrying an accent I could not place within any region of imperial space. "He is expecting me. I should have demanded credentials. I should have triggered security protocols. I should have done anything other than rise from my desk and walk to the regent's study door to announce the visitor's arrival. But I found my body moving without conscious instruction, my voice speaking words I had not chosen, my hands opening doors I had no authority to open. The regent was standing when I entered as if he had been waiting, as if he had known. "Leave us," he said, and the weight of those words pressed me backward, out of the study, through the antechamber, into the corridor beyond. The door closed behind me with a sound of absolute finality. I stood in that corridor for 6 hours. I could not have moved if I had wanted to. My body remained frozen in place, held by some force I could not identify, while my mind circled endlessly around the implications of what I had witnessed. The visitor was one of the Emperor's sons, one of the Primarchs. I had seen images of these transhuman demigods, the genetic children of the master of mankind, the commanders of the great legions that enforced imperial law across the galaxy. I had processed their communications, logged their campaigns, tracked their movements through the endless bureaucratic machinery of the Crusade administration, but I had never seen one in person, never stood close enough to feel the wrongness of their existence, the impossible perfection that set them apart from the humanity they were created to lead. And this particular son should not have been on Terra. All the Primarchs were supposed to be at the front, leading their legions in the final campaigns of the Crusade, bringing the last defiant worlds into imperial compliance. None had returned to Terra in years. None had reason to return, with the galaxy still unconquered and the Emperor engaged in projects that excluded even his sons from his presence. Yet one stood now in the regent's study, engaged in a conversation I would have given years of my life to overhear. When the door finally opened and movement returned to my limbs, dawn was breaking over the Himalayan peaks. The visitor had gone, vanished by whatever means had brought them to the palace without detection. The regent stood in the doorway of his study, his ancient face carved with lines that seemed deeper than they had been the night before, his eyes carrying a weight of knowledge that bent his spine like a physical burden. "You will speak of this to no one," he said. "You did not see what you have seen. You do not know what you have learned." I nodded, though we both understood the futility of the command. Some knowledge cannot be unlearned. Some truths, once perceived, reshape the observer in ways that denial cannot undo. "There will be war," I said. The words emerged without planning, speaking themselves before my conscious mind could intervene. The regent did not deny it. He simply looked at me with those storm cloud eyes, measuring me against criteria I would never understand, and spoke the words that have echoed through all the decades since. "There has been war since the moment of creation. What comes now is merely its revelation." He turned and walked back into his study. I returned to my desk. The palace continued its eternal routines around us, servitors shuffling through their programmed tasks, functionaries processing their endless paperwork, the great machinery of imperial governance grinding forward as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I knew it now, knew it with a certainty that transcended mere suspicion. The Primarchs were turning against their father, the legions were splitting into factions, The greatest military force in human history was preparing to tear itself apart, and I, a minor bureaucratic functionary with no power and no importance, had witnessed the shadow of that treachery before it emerged into the light. The weeks that followed were the longest of my existence. I continued my duties, processing correspondence, maintaining schedules, ensuring the smooth operation of the Regent's administrative apparatus. But I watched now with different eyes. I listened with different ears. Every document that crossed my desk became a potential clue, every communication a possible indication of loyalty or betrayal. And slowly, terribly, the pattern I had glimpsed began to reveal its true scope. The Regent was not surprised by the coming war. He was preparing for it. I discovered this through the same obsessive attention to detail that had led me to notice the communication absences. Small things, individually meaningless, that accumulated into an undeniable picture when viewed together. Requisition orders for supplies that made no sense for peacetime administration. Personnel transfers that placed specific individuals in specific locations for no apparent reason. Construction projects in the palace's deepest levels that appeared in no official documentation but consumed resources on a scale that suggested massive undertaking. The Sigillite was building defenses, not for the palace itself, which was already the most fortified structure in human history, but for something beneath it, something hidden so deeply that even his direct attendant could only perceive its existence through the shadows it cast on ordinary administration. I should have been comforted by these preparations. If the Regent knew what was coming, if he was taking steps to counter the threat, then perhaps the Imperium would survive whatever treachery was brewing among the Primarchs. Perhaps the Emperor's closest advisor had plans in place that would preserve everything we had built, but the nature of those preparations terrified me more than any threat of war. I found a document I should not have found. It was filed incorrectly, placed in a routine administrative folder rather than the secured archive where it belonged. A simple clerical error, the kind that occurs thousands of times daily in any bureaucratic system. But this particular error placed a contingency memorandum in my hands, a single page that outlined protocols for what the document termed catastrophic succession scenarios. The protocols assumed the Emperor would fall, not merely be absent or indisposed or engaged in projects that prevented his direct rule. Fall. The document used that specific word, with all its implications of defeat and destruction, and it outlined steps to be taken in the aftermath of that impossible event. I read those protocols 3 times before. The full horror of their implications penetrated my understanding. The Regent was not preparing to prevent the coming war. He was preparing to survive it. He was preparing for a future in which the Emperor's sons turned against their father and succeeded in bringing him down. The contingency document was dated 6 months before my arrival at the Regent's service, 6 months before the sealed dispatch arrived, 6 months before the communication blackouts began. The Sigillite had known about the treachery before it existed. He had seen it coming, had prepared for it, had built his contingencies around the assumption of its success, and he had done nothing to prevent it. I could not reconcile this with anything I understood about duty or loyalty or the nature of imperial service. The Regent was the Emperor's closest advisor, his most trusted confidant, the keeper of secrets that could reshape galaxies. If anyone could have warned the master of mankind about the danger brewing among his sons, it was the Sigillite. If anyone could have prevented the coming catastrophe, it was the ancient being who sat behind that light-absorbing desk and saw patterns in the flow of information that no other mind could perceive. Yet he had chosen preparation over prevention. He had chosen survival over salvation. Why? The question consumed me through the final weeks of my service. I continued my duties with mechanical precision, processing documents, maintaining schedules, ensuring the Regent's administrative apparatus functioned without interruption. But my mind circled endlessly around that single word in the contingency document, that assumption of imperial failure that suggested knowledge beyond mere anticipation. The Regent knew the Emperor would fall because the Emperor had told him. This realization came to me one morning as I watched the Sigillite emerge from a communication session in the palace's highest tower, a chamber reserved for direct communion with the master of mankind himself. His face bore the same expression I had seen after reading the sealed dispatch, the same grief-tinged acceptance, the same quiet confirmation of terrible expectations. The Emperor knew his sons would betray him. He had always known, and he had chosen to let it happen. I cannot explain the theological implications of this understanding. Greater minds than mine have spent centuries debating the nature of the Emperor's foresight, the limits of his prescience, the reasons behind his decisions in those final years before the war erupted. I only know what I perceived in that moment, watching the Regent descend from his communion with the master of mankind. The coming war was not a failure of vigilance. It was not a tragedy that could have been prevented. It was, in some terrible sense I could barely comprehend, intended. The Emperor had seen the treachery of his sons before their creation, and had created them anyway. He had built the Imperium knowing it would burn. He had forged the tools of humanity's salvation, knowing those tools would turn against their maker. I do not know why. I suspect no mortal mind could understand the reasons, any more than an insect could understand the motivations of the boot descending toward it. But the Regent understood, or at least accepted, and his acceptance shaped everything that followed. The last day of my service began like any other. I arrived at my desk in the pre-dawn hours, organized the morning's documentation, prepared the Regent's scheduling matrix for review. The palace hummed with its usual rhythms, servitors and functionaries, moving through their appointed tasks, the great machinery of imperial governance, grinding forward without pause. Then the alerts began. I heard them first as a distant sound, sirens and alarm bells echoing through corridors that had never known such warnings. The palace's internal communication network erupted with priority messages, each one marked with authentication codes I had never seen before, each one carrying the same terrifying phrase, "Stellar Defense Compromise." Lunar approaches detected. All personnel to defensive positions. The war had begun. I should have fled to a shelter. I should have followed the emergency protocols that every palace functionary was required to memorize. Instead, I walked to the Regent's study, drawn by a compulsion I could not resist, and found him standing at the great windows that overlooked the Himalayan peaks. He was not watching the mountains. He was watching the sky, where the first flashes of orbital combat were beginning to illuminate the darkness. Ships were dying up there, thousands of lives ending in nuclear fire and hard vacuum. The opening shots of a war that would consume millions before it ended. "You should not be here," he said without turning. "No," I agreed, "but I need to understand. Understanding will not save you. Nothing will save you now, or me, or any of us. The die was cast long before either of us was born. Then why prepare? Why build contingencies? Why do any of it, if the outcome was already determined?" The Regent turned from the window. In the light of the burning ships, his ancient face seemed less human than ever, a mask carved from materials that predated humanity's emergence from old Earth's cradle. "Because survival is not victory," he said, "and defeat is not extinction. The Emperor will fall, his sons will break the Imperium, trillions will die in the conflagration, but something will remain, something must remain, and that remaining is what we prepare for." He walked past me, toward the door of his study, toward the corridors that would take him to whatever command center had been prepared for this moment. But he paused at the threshold, turning to look at me one final time. "You have served well," he said. "You have seen what others could not see, understood what others refused to understand. There will be a place for you in what comes after, if you survive what comes before." He was gone before I could respond. I never saw him again. The war consumed the galaxy over the following years. I survived as he had predicted, though survival became its own form of torment. I watched the Imperium tear itself apart, watched the Emperor's sons slaughter each other across 1,000 worlds, watched the dream of unity and progress drown in blood and fire. I processed the casualty reports, the same work I had done for decades, but now the numbers were measured in planetary populations rather than individual lives. And through it all, I carried the knowledge I had gained in those final months of service, the knowledge that it had been foreseen, the knowledge that it had been allowed, the knowledge that somewhere in the Emperor's incomprehensible vision, this agony served a purpose beyond mortal understanding. That knowledge has been my companion for 7 decades now. It has kept me company through the reconstruction, through the long, slow transformation of the Imperium into something grimmer and more desperate than its founders imagined. It has whispered to me in the darkness, reminding me of sealed dispatches and hidden visitors and contingency documents that assumed catastrophe. The Regent was right, something remained. Something survived the treachery of the Emperor's sons and the breaking of the Imperium's dream. But what survives is not what was. What survives is a shadow, a hollow echo of the civilization that burned, maintained by faith and fear and the endless grinding machinery of bureaucratic control. I was there when the shadow first fell. I watched it spread across the galaxy, watched it consume everything it touched, watched it transform the Imperium into something that would have horrified its creators. And I said nothing, did nothing, simply continued my duties as I had always done, a human cogitator processing data until death released me from service. The Medicae servitors tell me I have perhaps 3 days remaining. 3 days to confess, 3 days to speak, 3 days to warn whoever might listen that the treachery is not ended. It has never ended. It continues in the silence between communications, in the patterns hidden within routine reports, in the footsteps that approach doors that should remain forever closed. I have carried this weight for 7 decades. Perhaps in these final days, someone else will take it from me. Perhaps they will understand what I could never explain. The Emperor knew his sons would betray him. He knew, and he let it happen, and somewhere in his impossible prescience he saw a purpose in that betrayal that justified the deaths of trillions. That purpose remains hidden, locked away in whatever remains of his consciousness, inaccessible to the mortals who inherited his broken Imperium. But I remember the Regent's words, spoken in the light of burning ships. Survival is not victory. Defeat is not extinction. Something will remain. Something must remain. And whatever that something is, whatever purpose it serves, I pray to whatever gods might listen that it was worth the price we paid. I pray, but I do not believe. I have not believed in anything since the day I watched the shadow fall across the Imperium, since the moment I understood that our masters had seen the catastrophe coming and chosen to let it arrive. Faith requires trust, and trust requires the possibility that those above us act in our interest rather than their own. The Emperor did not act in our interest. The Regent did not act in our interest. They acted for purposes we cannot comprehend, toward goals we will never see achieved, and we who served them were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded when our usefulness ended. That is the truth I carry. That is the knowledge that has consumed 70 years of my existence. That is the shadow of treachery that fell across my life on the day a courier with unfamiliar footsteps delivered a sealed dispatch to the Regent's desk. I am Marcus Whitfield. I served the Sigillite in the final months before the galaxy burned. I watched the shadow fall, and I said nothing. And I have spent 7 decades wondering whether silence was wisdom or cowardice. Now, at the end, I find the distinction no longer matters. The shadow has consumed everything. The treachery has become the foundation of our civilization, and we who remember what came before are dying one by one, taking our memories into the void where they can harm no one. Perhaps that is the purpose. Perhaps the Emperor foresaw that the truth would need to die with us, that the lie of heroic struggle and noble sacrifice must replace the reality of calculated catastrophe. Perhaps the new Imperium requires ignorance as its foundation, faith as its mortar, and the convenient death of witnesses as its final seal. I do not know. I will never know. I will die in 3 days with questions that will never be answered, and the shadow will continue spreading across the galaxy, and someone else will notice patterns in the communications, and someone else will see visitors who should not exist, and someone else will begin the long, slow journey toward understanding that I completed 7 decades ago. The treachery was not an ending. It was a beginning. And whatever comes next, I will not live to see it. Emperor preserve.